It was supposed to be a routine test. Just another quiet night in the heart of Soviet Ukraine, where engineers monitored dials and gauges beneath concrete towers humming with power. Yet within hours, an invisible fire will consume not only a reactor, but the future of an empire. On the 26th of April, 1986, Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant exploded, hurling radioactive ash into the skies and fear into the veins of a continent. But the greater tragedy was not the explosion, it was the silence that followed. A silence enforced by the weight of Soviet pride, a silence that cost lives, trust, and perhaps the Soviet Union itself. So how did one of the most technologically advanced regimes on Earth allow such a catastrophe to occur? What fatal errors and deeper truths ignited the world's worst nuclear disaster? This is the story of Chernobyl. A story not only of radiation and fire, but of secrets, sacrifice, and the staggering cost of denial. To understand the reactor that failed, we must understand the world that built it. In the decades following World War II, the Soviet Union was locked in a fierce rivalry with the West, not only in arms and ideology, but in technology. The race for supremacy took many forms: space, science, and power. Nuclear energy became the crown jewel of Soviet modernity, clean, efficient, and symbolic of mankind's dominion over nature. By the early 1980s, nuclear power provided nearly 10% of the USSR's electricity, and ambitious plans projected a five-fold increase by the year 2000. Chernobyl was not just a power plant, it was a monument. Built in northern Ukraine, near the Pripyat River, the station's design featured 6 planned RBMK-type reactors, each capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of power. 4 were operational by 1983. The remaining 2 were underway. The RBMK design was favored for its low cost and rapid construction, but it came with compromises, structural flaws, and dangerous instabilities when operated at low power. Warnings had been raised. They were dismissed. That was the Soviet way. In Pripyat, the city built to house the plant's workers, over 50,000 people lived in comfort by Soviet standards, modern apartments, schools, even an amusement park scheduled to open for May Day 1986. The city was young, the average age of residents just 26. There was optimism in the air, and radiation beneath their feet. Friday, the 25th of April, 1986. The staff at Reactor 4 began preparing for a safety test, an experiment to see whether the reactor could still cool itself in the event of a blackout. On paper, it was simple. In practice, it would violate every safety protocol in the book. At 1:06 a.m., the reactor's power began to drop. The day shift's experienced engineers started the power down, but the test was suddenly delayed by a request from Kyiv's grid controller, who needed the plant's electricity to meet peak demand. The power stayed high for hours. Then, late that night, after a full shift change, the night crew resumed the test. Under pressure, and in the dark, both figuratively and literally, about the dangers ahead. By midnight, the control room was manned by less experienced operators. They resumed lowering the reactor's power, but it dropped too far, too fast, plunging to just 30 megawatts, a dangerously unstable level. To compensate, operators pulled control rods from the core, reducing the number to just 8, well below the required 15. The reactor was now a ticking bomb. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. Moments later, a massive power surge erupted inside the reactor. The emergency shutdown was initiated, but the control rods jammed. Within seconds, the core exploded. A fireball tore through the concrete, hurling the 1,000-ton steel lid skyward. Flames illuminated the night sky. Graphite blocks burned. Radiation spilled like a ghost into the air. And in that moment, the myth of Soviet invincibility began to melt. In the control room, confusion reigned. Operators had never been trained to imagine, let alone respond to a core explosion. Some believed the reactor was still intact. Others, like shift supervisor Anatoly Dyatlov, refused to believe an explosion had even occurred. To admit such a thing would be to accept the collapse of their entire command structure. But the evidence was already everywhere. On the roof, pieces of fuel rods and graphite smoldered. Radiation levels near the reactor exceeded 30 roentgens per hour, a lethal dose in seconds. Yet without proper meters, no one knew just how bad it was. Firefighters from Pripyat rushed in without protective gear, thinking it was a conventional electrical fire. Many stood directly over the burning core, unaware that each breath was saturating their bodies with invisible death. One firefighter, Vasily Ignatenko, picked up a piece of glowing debris with his bare hands. His skin began to peel off by morning. He was dead within weeks. Yet even as radiation poured into the sky, orders were issued to maintain secrecy. There was to be no evacuation, no public warning. The May Day parade must go on. The residents of Pripyat woke to a crimson sky. Some thought it beautiful. Children played in radioactive dust. Adults gathered on bridges to watch the glow, unknowingly exposing themselves to one of the highest radiation doses of the disaster. Doctors began noticing strange symptoms: metallic tastes, vomiting, sudden burns, but still, no one spoke the truth. By the end of the day, a full 24 hours after the explosion, radiation had reached Sweden. Nuclear plants there detected unusual spikes, forcing Swedish authorities to raise international alarm. Only then did Moscow acknowledge something had gone wrong, but even that admission was wrapped in deception. On the 27th of April, over 36 hours after the explosion, buses rolled into Pripyat. Loudspeakers announced an evacuation temporary. They said residents were told to pack lightly. Most brought just a change of clothes and some documents. Many left pets behind, thinking they'd be back in a few days. They would never return. More than 50 people were relocated that day. In the following weeks, a 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established, displacing overseeing residents from surrounding towns and villages. But the Soviet response wasn't just logistical, it became ideological. The Kremlin scrambled to protect the image of the state. Initial reports described a minor accident, no mention of the deaths, the chaos, or the radioactive plume stretching across Europe. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader known for his glasnost openness, remained silent for 18 days. When he finally addressed the nation, his tone was cold, bureaucratic, and vague. Behind closed doors, a new war had begun, not against NATO, but against radiation. Over 600 null men soldiers, miners, engineers, known as liquidators, were sent to contain the disaster. Many were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Some were given only shovels and lead aprons, tasked with cleaning radioactive debris from the roof of the reactor. Nicknamed the most dangerous job in the world, when robots failed due to high radiation, men took their place. Their bravery prevented a second far worse explosion, one that might have contaminated half of Europe's water supply. But the cost was terrible. Thousands died prematurely. Tens of thousands suffered cancers, genetic mutations, psychological trauma. And yet, their stories were buried, forgotten, redacted, because in the Soviet Union, failure did not exist, only sacrifice. What caused Chernobyl? It was more than human error, more than a reactor flaw. It was the result of a system built on fear. The RBMK reactor design had several fatal weaknesses: a positive void coefficient, graphite-tipped control rods, and instability at low power. Western experts had flagged such issues for years, but Soviet designers prioritized cost and speed over safety. Warnings were ignored, dispunished. In 1982, a smaller accident had occurred at Chernobyl kept secret from the public. In 1983, the Soviet Academy of Sciences recommended reviewing RBMK safety protocols. Nothing changed. Why? Because acknowledging flaws meant admitting weakness, and in the Cold War, weakness was treason. Anatoly Dyatlov, the man in charge the night of the disaster, was known for his authoritarian demeanor. Some say he browbeat operators into proceeding despite protests. Others argue he was following institutional pressure, a cog in a machine that tolerated no hesitation. In truth, the test was doomed before it began. It was scheduled without proper review, conducted during a shift change, and executed by undertrained staff using outdated procedures. The plant manager had already falsified safety records to earn awards. Chernobyl was not an accident. It was the climax of a system that valued appearance over reality, obedience over expertise. And when the atom rebelled, there was no one left to stop it. After the explosion, Chernobyl became a fortress of lies. Hospitals in Moscow overflowed with radiation victims flown in from Ukraine and Belarus. Doctors were ordered not to record radiation sickness as a cause of death. Official records listed pneumonia, burns, or cardiac arrest. Families were silenced with threats. Widows were told to stay quiet. Photographs disappeared. Funeral dates were altered. But some truth could not be buried. Valery Legasov, a respected Soviet physicist and member of the initial Chernobyl Response Commission, tried to speak honestly. He knew the dangers were greater than admitted. He had seen the graphite, the radiation, the chaos. In private meetings, Legasov clashed with Soviet officials, demanding changes in nuclear policy and transparency. For 2 years, he fought to reform a system that refused to learn from its own catastrophe. On the second anniversary of the disaster, he took his own life. Before doing so, he recorded a series of tapes, a confession of everything he had seen, everything he had been forced to hide. Those tapes, smuggled out by colleagues, became a turning point. The Soviet people began to ask questions. Why had they been lied to? Why were their children coughing blood, their livestock born deformed, their homes condemned? And as questions turned to anger, the pillars of the regime began to crack. Chernobyl did not just poison the air, it poisoned trust. By 1989, the Soviet Union was unraveling. Years of economic stagnation, political repression, and the rising cost of nuclear secrecy had eroded the social contract. Chernobyl became a symbol not just of technological failure, but of systemic rot. Gorbachev himself would later say, the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is difficult to measure how many lives Chernobyl altered. Some estimates suggest up to 93. Zero cancer deaths may eventually be linked to the disaster. 330,000 people were permanently displaced. Over 600 towns, villages, and settlements across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated, some never to be inhabited again. The zone of exclusion became a frozen time capsule, abandoned buildings, gas masks on desks, school books on shelves, radiation meters clicking endlessly in empty hallways. For those who survived, the trauma is generational. Children born in the years after suffered birth defects, immune disorders, and lifelong health complications. Entire communities were relocated into cities where they were labeled as dirty, shona, or forgotten. Meanwhile, Soviet nuclear policy, once a badge of pride, became a subject of shame and fear. In the decades since, Chernobyl has haunted the world like a radioactive ghost. Every time a reactor malfunctions, every time a government hides the truth, Chernobyl is remembered. The Chernobyl disaster did more than release isotopes. It forced the world to confront the terrifying reality of human error amplified by atomic power. Internationally, it spurred reforms. The International Atomic Energy Agency pushed for new safety protocols. Governments began building containment structures, improving early warning systems, and sharing nuclear data more transparently. But the core question still lingers. Can any human system, no matter how advanced, truly control the atom? In 2016, 30 years after the explosion, a massive steel sarcophagus, the new safe confinement, was placed over Reactor 4. It cost over $2 billion and involved engineers from 30 countries. It will last 100 years, and after that, no one knows. Radiation in the reactor's ruins will remain deadly for at least 20,000 years. Even today, deep within the belly of the plant, a lava-like mass known as the elephant's foot still exists, a superheated mixture of sand, steel, and melted uranium. It cannot be touched. It cannot be removed. It waits in silence, a monument to everything mankind thought it could control and could not. The name Chernobyl comes from a wild plant wormwood. In the Bible's book of Revelation, wormwood falls from the sky to poison a third of the waters. Many called it a prophecy. Others, a coincidence. But one truth remains: Chernobyl was not just a disaster of fire and radiation. It was a mirror held up to modern civilization, exposing the dangers of pride, secrecy, and the illusion of mastery over nature. The reactor may have exploded in 1986, but its fallout continues in policy, in memory, in the quiet ticking of Geiger counters, and in that haunting silence. One question still echoes: if the past could speak, would we finally listen? Or would we, once again, turn the dial and run the test? If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to Legacy Files, where history isn't just remembered, it's relived.